We're joined now by the Labour MP, Ian Murray, and the SNP MP, Stephen Gethens. Morning to both of you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Ian Murray, first of all, is there any measure by which you think Scottish independence is more credible now?
Well, it certainly makes the grievance towards Scottish independence more credible, but I don't see the arguments of 2014 being any more credible now than they were then. The economic case is worse, certainly, than it was then. The issues around membership of the European Union have not been resolved and can't be resolved in this particular issue. And I think what we're seeing and what we'll hear from Mr Blair, the former Prime Minister,
we hadn't voted to leave the EU last time around.
But that doesn't make the arguments around independence any easier to make. The economic case is certainly much more difficult. If you looked at the oil figures yesterday in terms of it now being a drain on the Treasury rather than being an £8 billion benefit to the Treasury, which is what was being promised, that's much more difficult. The issues around whether or not Scotland and an independent country would be a member of the European Union, the issues around the currency and the economics of all this, the issue around Brexit, when you look at it in the context of Scottish independence, is I'm hopeful that people will sit back and think a little bit more carefully about whether or not it's in the economic interests of Scotland and the future of Scotland to be an independent country. And the conclusion, given what we've seen in 2014 and the fact the case is much more difficult to make, is no, and we shouldn't be having discussions about another independent referendum while we're going through this Brexit process.
So is what Tony Blair is going to say this evening, does that damage, basically, the future arguments for if there were to be a second independence referendum? Does it damage the Labour Party in particular?
Well, I think Tony Blair's expressing today the frustration of many of us in terms of being pro-European and want to stay within or as close a relationship to the European Union as possible, because he's saying that we don't know what the outcome is. He's saying it's being driven by immigration above all else. And we're not only looking at a hard Brexit, but we're looking at a Brexit at all costs. Now, you can draw a direct comparison across to the Scottish referendum, where in actual fact the proponents of independence are saying independence at all costs, because they aren't looking at the issues around what's in the best interests of Scotland, and people have already voted quite clearly to stay within the United Kingdom with close ties to Europe, and that's what we should all be working towards to deliver.
But do you agree with him that the possibility of a breakup of the UK puts, as he says, there is a Scottish referendum back on the table, and this time, he says, with a context much more credible for the independence case?
Well, it's certainly back on the table. The Conservatives have made sure it's back on the table with the gamble to take...
Well, this is Tony Blair saying this, not the Conservatives.
But what I'm saying is that the gamble to take the UK out of the European Union, of course it puts it back on the table, and Tony Blair also puts it in the context of Northern Ireland, with the big issues around how the border is controlled there, the big issues around the Good Friday Agreement and how that's stitched together as a main component of being part of the European Union. All of these issues certainly put the Union at risk, and I think the Conservative Party, Theresa May and indeed Ruth Davidson, have got a significant number of questions to answer about why they've taken again Scotland to the brink of what would be a disastrous independence, and I think that's what Tony Blair's point is.
Let me bring in Stephen Gethens here. Is this manna from heaven for you?
Well, I think what Tony Blair is saying is what I'm hearing from a lot of people, which is the case for independence is more credible. I mean, Ian talks about the economy and where we're going in the future. Don't forget, the Scottish Government offered a compromise that, has been talked about elsewhere in Europe, and there are reports of a European Parliament report welcoming aspects of this of this compromise to keep us in the single market. Because let's not forget the devastating impact on our economy will come from the Tories' hard Brexit. The Tory plans to take us out of the single market, take us out of the European Union, will have a significant impact on our country. And also, let's not forget the impact that has on opportunities for young people, our research, and the food and drink industry, all these different areas which will be damaged adversely by any plans to take us out of the EU, and significantly by taking us out of the single market as well.
And does Tony Blair and what he's saying here, does that lend more credibility to your argument for an independent Scotland?
Well, I think it's always good to have people coming on side in terms of independence. We're seeing more and more of them, but I think what it does is this debate is changing, and this debate is evolving. And certainly one thing that I'm finding is a lot more people are open to the idea of independence, especially
is Tony Blair the sort of I mean, he's saying he doesn't support independence, but by saying that the context is now very different, you know, for the case for a second independence referendum, I mean, is he a useful person to say something like this?
Well, it's always good to have people involved in the debate. But look, the context is different. We were promised that
even
the only way to
someone that the SNP previously described as a war criminal.
Well, this is somebody that took us into an illegal war in Iraq. That fact has not changed.
It
but
wasn't
look,
illegal. That is not a fact.
If we're going to talk about the future of Scotland, our economic opportunities, then of course we should be talking about our future in the European Union. Now, we were promised that the only way that Scotland could maintain its membership of the European Union was to vote against independence. We were then told that if the UK voted to leave the European Union, we'd get powers over issues like immigration, actually, incidentally, powers that would make it easier for us to remain part of the single market. And we're being told that we're not getting these either. So I'm not sure how many broken promises that you can take. The context has changed. A devastating hard Tory Brexit would have an impact on each and every one of us. Let's not forget, on our rights, on our environment, on our economy,
but you don't
on our
compound
research
that by
institution.
making a decision to make Scotland independent. That would compound the problem. When you talk about being part of the European Union, the deficit in Scotland at the moment is 9.5%. It's double the UK's, and you require a 3% deficit even to enter into talks to be in the European Union.
Ian Murray, one second. Ian Murray, let me just ask you though, if Tony Blair, someone like Tony Blair, a former Prime Minister and leader of the Labour Party, comes out and says something like he's saying today, like the context is now more credible for the case for independence, what does that do to the Labour Party's stance and to Jeremy Corbyn? How much does that undermine him?
Well, I don't think it undermines anyone. The case is still quite clear, and the whole context of
Do you not
Blair's
consider
speech
him
today,
to be a credible enough figure to say something like this?
But the whole context of his speech today
but
is
do
to
you
say
or do
that
you not?
Brexit at all costs is going to be damaging from the country. And what he's saying is that people have to sit back and realise that if they want to try and fight against this Brexit at all costs that Conservatives are currently giving the country, then we have to rise up and do that. That's the whole context of his speech. You don't then take a quantum leap to say that the context of his speech is this is bad for the country and therefore Scottish independence should happen and that would be disastrous for the country. That's just not something that's connected together. He's doing it in the context of the United Kingdom and all the nations, including Northern Ireland, where he was obviously right at the heart of the Good Friday Agreement and the Northern Ireland peace process. It's bad for Scotland to be even talking about having a second independence referendum at the moment, and all the issues that Stephen Gethens has just rightly raised in terms of the potential consequences to the UK of a hard or a Brexit at all costs.
And is it bad for Jeremy Corbyn and for the Labour Party to have a former party leader talking about it then?
Well, I think he's raising the issues that we're all talking about constantly in the media and in the press at the moment about the constitutional context of the United Kingdom. And what we're saying quite clearly is a post-Brexit, a new Britain post-Brexit requires new thinking around how the UK operates. And we're proposing that we keep the UK together with a new active union that is based on a federal model that keeps the UK together, which is what people voted for. And then we'd be able to make sure that we've got close ties with the European Union. That's what we should all be striving for on this particular issue instead of compounding a bad decision with an even worse decision.
Stephen Gethens?
That's not. Look, we're in a situation whereby, and it's disappointing for me, because he and I voted against triggering Article 50, where he's talking about union at all costs, at maintaining the union at all costs. Now, the Scottish Government proposed a compromise in terms of remaining part of the single market. That still appears to be live, but we're not very hopeful in terms of what we're hearing from Westminster at the moment. The only blockage to a deal that could save jobs is coming from Whitehall at the moment. So I'm not sure that having a union at all costs is what we want. Now, the Fraser-Vallender Institute have argued that 80,000 jobs, or it could cost 80,000 jobs by a hard Tory Brexit. Now, these are the realities that we're facing. I hope that the UK government will come round to considering the Scottish Government's compromise, but we always have to keep our options open in these other regards. These plans will be devastating for our economy. So if we're isolated on the edge of Europe as part of the United Kingdom, that hits our economy, hits our opportunities for young people, hits our research institutions, hits every part of our lives. And that's something that we seriously need to consider.
Stephen Gethens is absolutely right.
We have a choice of two futures right now.
Stephen's saying we should be, and this is the exact quote that Tony Blair will use today, he will say we need to expose relentlessly the actual costs of Brexit. But what Stephen's unwilling to do is to expose relentlessly the actual cost of Scottish independence, and it would be variably worse.
That's rubbish, Ian.
Well, that's you both will obviously disagree on the facts and the costs of either side of that argument. But Stephen Gethens, I mean, is the issue of a second independence, is that something that you feel there is a genuine case for now, that as Tony Blair is going to argue today, the context is different now, that there is more credibility or not? Is it something that you feel perhaps the party might be pushed into to appease party members? What is your personal view of this?
I think, look, we're in a very different situation from the one that we were in 2014. And the different situation is that Scotland risks being taken out of the European Union against its will. I mean, let's not forget, the biggest gap between Leave and Remain anywhere in the United Kingdom was a 24-point gap in Scotland in favour of remaining part of the European Union. So the context is very, very different, and people will consider it in very, very different terms, and that's as should be. But we're in a situation whereby, having voted to remain, that having given this compromise it would help save jobs, we're seeing this political blockage at Whitehall. A political decision could be made to keep us part of the single market, to help save some of those jobs, and that's something that we're at risk of being turned down. So in terms of the Scottish Government's compromise, the ball is very much in Westminster's court.
The European Union has quite clearly said that Scotland could not stay part of the single market when the UK exits the European Union. That's the fact of the matter. You're talking about things that are undeliverable. You've given a list of undeliverables, so you can
it's not certainly not
Germany, France, Ireland, where these decisions are being taken. There's an open-mindedness to this happened, and there's a European Parliament report we know from this morning's newspapers coming out and saying that this could be considered, and the blockage is coming from Whitehall.
Well, we shall see. There's certainly no will in the UK, it seems, to go down that route. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us, both Labour MP Ian Murray and the SNP MP Stephen Gethens there.